Hey guys, today we're looking at some footage of what I call Tartarian infrastructure here in Toronto, Ontario. And Toronto is a very huge city, but I think a lot of us don't realize, I grew up there, I think a lot of us don't realize how old it really is, how old the infrastructure is, and how much of the city really is just this old red brick building. They're still tearing down lots of it, and some of it is much more sturdy, like this bank. It looks like a Roman bank. Another example, it looks like Roman infrastructure. And a lot of this stuff, it looks like you would see in Germany. But this is, of course, what we see all across Canada, all across America, Australia, South America. And all of this is well within our capacity to build. It's just that it doesn't line up with the period. It doesn't line up with the type of people that were here. It doesn't line up with why they were here. It doesn't line up with the resources that they had. The first floors of windows and entrances being bricked up and changed doesn't line up with anything that's been written about. And of course, you can just walk around the city and see the extensive modifications over the many years. Pretty much all of these buildings and all the foundations, if it's not a skyscraper, it looks to be an old world Tartarian building. And growing up here, I also definitely did not notice the intricate detail on a lot of the old buildings, and I didn't know that what we call restoration mostly means taking these details away. You know, a lot of times all of the ornaments, all the little gargoyles, all the little attachments on the building, the iron facades, a lot of it is taken right away with restoration, and it ends up looking like a modern building, even though it is quite old, and we can look on the old pictures and they're still there. And they gave various excuses for lots of the city being destroyed in the past, just like pretty much every other major city. Toronto had its own great fires, and they said this is what destroyed much of the city, yet as we can see, much of the old city still exists. In fact, it seems to be the majority of the city infrastructure is still this old world infrastructure that really it is not explained in mainstream history. They really barely even attempt to. I thought this was pretty cool here, this spire thing sticking out, because you look down and it goes way down, and it just makes me wonder how deep the original street really was. And I think it was clearly a full floor underneath what it is now. And of course, every city has stories of hidden subway lines and stuff, and honestly, I think a lot of the subway lines were pretty much basically already there. We might have dusted them off, we might have had to clean them up a bit, but in some places it looks like there was tracks already there and we just showed up and dusted them off. And same with our sewer systems. Potentially our whole sewer system is built on top of another one. Potentially we've tapped into the old one. By the way, it's interesting to note that a lot of these big buildings, big huge downtown buildings, these old Tartarian buildings, I always wondered how they were heated, because they're not using wood, of course, and even in the modern time we're not using electrical heating, and they're not using natural gas either. It turns out a lot of them are using steam heat, and it turns out, of course, that steam heat system is old. So there's these big factories basically producing steam in the city, and that's what's pumping into these big buildings, and it makes sense. There's really no other way to heat these buildings. These things are massive. And so I thought that was fascinating, because you look at a lot of old pictures and you see all these smokestacks, and people are saying that these were connected to fireplaces. But we have lots of questions about fireplaces. The old fireplaces don't look like they were used to have fires. And so those stacks, those appear to be steam stacks in my opinion. And I think the old world was heated by steam. And this is part of what I really love about Mudflood research, is that you can just go outside into any major city basically, and you can just see this evidence all around, and you can just start putting the pieces together and thinking, you know, really how would the building end up looking like this if history was as they say it was? Would we really have the first layer of windows and doors blocked up and changed without writing about it, without recording it, you know, without teaching future architects to make sure that they take account for the foot or 2 foot of silt or whatever that tends to build up, I guess, every 10 years or however they're saying it works? I don't know, but we don't seem to account for it when we build modern buildings. We seem to push the mud out of the way, find the bedrock, or build a nice deep foundation down, make sure that's all protected against the grass. Of course, that's why we also had to go in and put new foundations in these mudflood buildings, because if we didn't do that, then the dirt would eat away at the brick, turn the brick back into mud basically, and then the building would fall down. Some of them did fall down and they weren't restored in time. But that's what we do to build modern buildings. We make sure our foundations are protected. So it really makes no sense that these people who build buildings like this, glorious buildings like this, that they did not account for their buildings sinking, supposedly. That's what people say. And by the way, I don't believe that at all, because I've seen mudflood buildings that are totally on bedrock, that are up in the Canadian Shield, and it's sitting on a gigantic rock, so there's absolutely no reason that they would sink. They would have built it on the rock, and now there's a whole, again, one story, the first story, covered in mud. So this whole area was covered in mud. And this area that we're looking at is like near the government center of Toronto, and it is really, really fancy. It really is glorious, actually. Like, it's underappreciated just walking by and going about your business, but looking at this, I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And again, this does not match up with our pioneer history. It does not match up with our early troubles in this country. We had wars going on, you know, we had all kinds of stuff going on. I do not see us building these cathedrals, and on the top of that, our old pictures and stuff really make it look like these cities were completely built up long before we got here. Here I'm underground in one of them, in one of the basements, and you can just see the extensive way that they've had to try and cope with the fact that these buildings were actually found in mud hills. First of all, they had to change all the entrances, they had to change a bunch of the window configurations and all this stuff, and then to make them habitable on the inside, they had to do so many crazy modifications just to make it seem functional. Because it doesn't make sense, right? When your first floor has been covered in mud, now you can no longer use the building as it was intended. You were meant to walk in and begin your journey of this building in this specific way, and all of that was changed with this mud flood. And I bet if you showed pictures of most of these buildings and asked whether people thought they were in Canada or Europe, I bet most of them would say Europe. And this is pretty much the same as everywhere when we talk about mud flood and this old world infrastructure, this Tartarian infrastructure. When you hold it up on its own and you don't tell people that it's in Chicago or Toronto or Buffalo, they assume that it's in, you know, Paris or Berlin. And the plaque here on this one said 1911, but almost every single building, especially these churches, if you look closer, there's other distinctions on the building that tell you how old it actually was, and usually the date that it's marked its christening, usually it's way after its construction, and that's even from what it says on the building. Here I was just showing that, once again, everywhere I go and try and get footage, it looks like at some point you can literally see and feel like the whole area was caught up in a mud flood. It still feels like you're on a mud hill. And if you look here, this is just another super interesting example of concrete restoration and concrete coming apart. A lot of us think that some of these modifications to the building are made of stone, and a lot of them are not. It's concrete, and I bet even the old world was made of concrete as well. At least a lot of it was. Maybe some of that concrete turned to stone. Maybe some of what we think are huge stone blocks are really concrete blocks. Definitely it's been shown that Stonehenge is basically made out of concrete. They say that's a modern restoration, but I bet the original one was made out of concrete too, if there even was an original one. Now look at this detail, and if you remember my former videos on the smaller towns and stuff, just picture these farm people building this. Just because they lived in the city didn't mean they were any different in terms of the overall culture. They had the same building skills as the people in the country, and the people in the country are said to build the same basic infrastructure, just not on the same scale. And it's unbelievable there, it's unbelievable here too, just because of the gargantuanism of all of it. And it barely makes sense now for a city that the area they say contains 6 million people here, and it's still housing 6 million people. It didn't have this many people. These buildings were here on our earliest photographs, and we've been using them ever since. And the mainstream history really doesn't have to come up with much of a story to explain these buildings, because they're not asked to. And if you look at stuff like this too, we just keep going on and on and on, modifying it further and further, and again, nobody seems to question the original foundations. Now, we're coming to the end of this video, and I'm going to leave you with one interesting thought, that they're saying that a lot of people are saying that these old buildings in history didn't have bathrooms in them and other, you know, necessities. So people are speculating that the old world people that inhabited this didn't need bathrooms, whereas I'm speculating that a lot of this stuff was kind of built for us, that it was either built by some sort of being, or they were come into being by some kind of force, without bathrooms, without elevators, without that type of stuff. Only basic dwellings that we then had to modify. It's just a theory, guys. That's all I've got for today. Appreciate you. Until next time. And definitely check out my newest book, Fake Diseases. It covers all of the major topics that come up, like birth defects, blood sugar problems, bone and joint problems, cancer, autoimmune problems, and more. And it's on Amazon for just $9.99. And the audiobook read-along version is free here on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description of this video.